Suppressors are strong in Tarkov. I mean really, really strong. Well, at least on the weapons that benefit them, because unfortunately, like weapons and armors in this game, attachments suffer the same fate that they are not all created equally. Some parts are just outright better than others for certain roles. You want better ergonomics on a DNMR? You run this. You want lower recoil and don't mind being loud with something like an AK? Use that. But when it comes to making your weapon quiet, removing muzzle flash, and having that tactical option available, some guns do it better than others. And this has only become more exacerbated by the many different nerfs to suppressors over the years, making their ergonomic penalties much more felt when being used. Even after all the changes they've gone through, some weapons just perform better because their suppressor options are not only more flexible, but also don't harm the weapon nearly as much as others. So we're going to go over some of the issues that Tarkov has with suppressors, and maybe some potential ideas to remedy this divide between the calibers. Right off the bat, I should mention that these issues are mainly with assault rifles and maybe a DMR. No other weapon type has these kinds of disparities between calibers with suppressors. Pistols are kind of a non-factor, and SMGs are actually pretty balanced. Shotguns, well, there's only two options for them, so that's fine. That leaves, again, mainly the rifles and the DMRs, and the biggest contention I see is between 545 and 556. How these suppressors simply behave so differently at a fundamental level. I know why they do, and it's important to bring attention to it though. For example, the way most 545 suppressors work, with one glaring exception, is that their attachment goes right on the weapon. Simple enough. No muzzle there already, you just slap it on. Now you're much quieter, you have no muzzle flash, and you have a decent amount of recoil reduction. So the AKs are simple as is. However, 556 weapons work a little differently. Most of their suppressors require an additional muzzle attachment to be properly fitted onto the weapon, and therein lies the problem. 556 can make their recoil reduction stats much higher than that of 545. An example would simply be the NT4 suppressor, one of the oldest in the entire game. That suppressor has a recoil reduction stat of 10% by itself, which is the same as the 545's PBS4 suppressor. However, what the NT4 has going for it is the additional muzzle attachment that is required to use it. That piece also has a recoil reduction stat, which is minus 8%. So technically, the NT4 has a total recoil reduction stat of minus 18%. Of course, this comes at the cost of an additional part needed to be used and a hefty minus 22 ergonomic penalty. But with 556 weapons in general, they can recoup that ergo penalty with relative ease. But I suppose the main problem here is that the two suppressors are fundamentally different. Some calibers get massive recoil reductions while other weapons struggle to achieve the same numbers. Now obviously the elephant in the room for the 545 weapons are the waffle AKs. This is the exception. However, even this one works differently, because where the massive recoil reduction comes from is from the muzzle device itself, not the suppressor. The muzzle device is a whopping minus 17% recoil, and the suppressor itself is only minus 7. So you get minus 24% total, more than the NT4. But where the reduction comes from is switched, it's the opposite. And this is the same across most AKs. It's the muzzle brake that does the heavy lifting, which is the opposite to 556. You can see how quickly and muddy this conversation gets, which is why it's somewhat difficult to talk about it, but these two calibers aren't the only issues with suppressors. 7.62 is also a funky caliber when it comes to attachments. In general, a lot of the 7.62 AKs have their own set of 3 suppressors, but out of all the calibers, these feel the worst to run. The AKM Hexagon, which gives minus 9%, the Zenit, which gives only 8.5%, and the PBS, which is minus 12%. While relatively solid, these numbers don't compare with other weapons, so what's to be done? Well, with a special attachment, you can run 308 suppressors on a 7.62 AK, making them immensely scarier than with their own weapon suppressors. And while I won't go over any specifics because there's a bunch of options and they're all relatively strong, it's crazy to me how you can run a suppressor of a different caliber without a conversion kit or something. I don't know exactly how all the inner workings of weapons and whether in a video game that would make remotely any sense, but allowing 7.62 weapons to have more powerful suppressor options is both interesting and potentially game-breaking at the same time. Again, not everything has to be the exact same numbers, but what could potentially make running loud weapons more common is to really emphasize those muzzle brakes on weapons where they shine. And to me, 5.45 and 7.62 are the two calibers I would most likely run loud currently. But what if 5.56 best in slot recoil reduction attachment was a loud muzzle brake? This is where we can get into some potential changes of how these systems work. The idea of making loud muzzle brakes best in slot for recoil reduction was the initial catalyst for this whole video. Imagining an M4 that wasn't suppressed, but instead had a huge muzzle on it with an insane amount of recoil reduction. That was what spurred me to talk about this in the first place. It's an interesting concept that loud and proud would be the go-to way of having guns with as little recoil as possible. And if you wanted to be suppressed, you would sacrifice some recoil reduction for the ability of stealth. I know I've been comparing Tarkov to BattleBit quite a lot recently, but that game has it so if you use a suppressor, you're sacrificing a portion of your better recoil if you want to run one and be quiet. It's an interesting tug of pros and cons. And something like that in Tarkov, universal across all weapons, would be fascinating to see and try out. You'd have more people running loud weapons with either flash hiders or muzzle brakes, and the suppressed weapons might be reserved for mainly SMGs, which would help facilitate a more specific role for them as well. Granted, this is all speculation. Depending on how the balance of the parts is, it could become even worse than what we have, where one muzzle is the best and that's all you see. So it may not be all good times, depending on what the values would be set at. I suppose you could have more than one option for best in slot, so at the very least you see some visual variety, and it isn't literally just one option in the game. But since that isn't ever going to happen, all we can do is hypothesize and come up with these what-if situations. Suppressors are arguably too strong in Tarkov. That's kind of the long and short of it. For some rifles, having a suppressor on it guarantees the most positive outcomes possible for you in terms of surviving gunfights. You get to have a quiet weapon, it has the least amount of recoil, and there's no muzzle flash. And it sounds really cool. But seriously, it's crazy how effective they can be on the right weapons, whereas for others, having nothing but a muzzle brake and going loud and proud is the most optimal way to run some guns. It would be interesting to see the game get flipped on its head and everyone running around loud and proud, and rarely seeing weapons with suppressors on them. Maybe an SMG or bolt action here and there for suppressors for specific roles, but again, the chances of the game pivoting like that is pretty much zero. At least we can imagine a game like that and talk about how it would play out. But what are your thoughts on suppressors in Tarkov? Are they too strong? Do they have enough drawbacks to where they feel balanced? Also, what's your consensus on having suppressors go on weapons that they aren't inherently built for? Please let me know down in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more videos talking about the potential ever-changing balance of attachments in Tarkov. I hope to see you in future ones.